Welcome everyone. If you don't know me, I am Daniel Sharp. I'm the editor of the Freethinker magazine and your host this evening. On the screen, you should be able to see our links, social media and website links. So if you're not familiar with us, please do check them out. And just so you're aware, this session is being recorded and it'll be uploaded to YouTube and added to our website afterwards as well. So here's how the webinar is going to work. Very shortly, I'm going to hand off to our guest, who will give an introduction to himself and speak for around 20, 25, 30 minutes. And then we'll open it up for discussion and questions. I won't say too much about our guest because he's going to talk about himself a little bit, I think. But our guest tonight is Dermot Trainor, who's an assistant professor of history at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas, where he teaches the history of the USA. Tonight, he's going to talk about Thomas Paine and his influence during America's Gilded Age and beyond. So with that out of the way, I'll hand over to you, Dermot, and hopefully I should be able to do this smoothly, allow you to share your screen now.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you. And hello, good evening, everyone in the UK. I suppose it's hello here from this afternoon in Kansas. Although, as you can tell, I'm not an American, so really this is a homecoming for me. A trip back to the UK already, it seems, this summer. So, yes, my name is Dermot Trainor. I am a professor of American history at a small college in Kansas in the United States. I got my PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2022. I suppose it's really the subject matter of that PhD which I'm here to speak tonight on. My PhD being on the rise and fall of the National Liberal Party of the United States. And as we'll see, Thomas Paine is a central figure and inspiration for that. So I've got a set two here prepared. I've got a prepared sort of presentation. But before that, if you'll allow me, I want to just sort of introduce my work more broadly here for a couple of minutes and talk about it generally. So my PhD thesis was really, through my own research, was really the uncovering of a very small, minute really, political party that existed in the United States of America in the late 19th century, especially really in the 1870s, in an era of American history known as Reconstruction, which is really like the dozen or so years after the American Civil War, when the Union of States is attempting to reconstruct itself. And, you know, in the aftermath of the Civil War, this is really a revolutionary era of American politics when you compare it to anything before or since. So we have the Civil War, which ends in 1865, along with the emancipation of the slaves, 4 million African American slaves in the South. They go from being former slaves in the course of a few years to being citizens. And it's albeit you know, able to vote and hold office and have real political power, albeit only for a brief time before there is a reaction to that revolution, a counter-revolution, if you will, which comes in the middle of the 1870s. But it's into this brief revolutionary window that this revolution for African American rights also inspires other progressive groups in the American zeitgeist. So we have, you know, the origins of the modern women's rights movement, the origins of the modern organized American labor movement, and other cultural movements can really trace a lot of their origins back to this Reconstruction era. And as it was for women's rights or for labor or for African American rights, so it was with the freethinkers in the United States, those American citizens who were engaged in political activism on behalf of atheists, agnostics, religious skeptics of all kinds. And what's really striking about this period of American history, within the history of the American free thought community, more so before or since, it's a period where American free thinkers themselves choose to get directly involved in American politics and not simply, shall we say, the debate taking place within American culture, but thinking about how their free thought worldview apply to mainstream political problems, secular issues more generally. So it's really this American free thought community in the 1870s. Thomas Paine, for these American free thinkers, Robert Ingersoll foremost amongst them, had always, of course, been a talismanic figure since the early years of the Republic. But really, it's in this era, strikingly, that American free thinkers organize and look back at Paine, but this time not the Paine of the Age of Reason so much, or even the Paine of common sense and freedom in the American Revolution, but the Paine of the French Revolution, the Paine of the rights of man, of agrarian justice. And what's incredible, frankly, is that we have a group of American free thinkers who decide to start a political party to get involved in mainstream politics, and the inspiration, the worldview of that political party is shaped by the works and writings of Thomas Paine, his prescriptions for how a secular society should be run. Um, so, and my thesis really covers the origins, the rise and fall of that party. Um, well, there's a lot to fit in, and not a lot of time. So, having given that overview, what I propose to do now is I've got sort of a set spiel prepared here, which I'll read from if you'll let me. Um, and really, what this does is it just gives what is essentially only the first chapter of my thesis, but I believe it kind of sets the ground. And then once I'm finished here, I'm more than happy to take any and all questions about Paine, freethinkers, and the Gilded Age, because the cast of characters in my narrative that I've managed to piece together through primary sources is vast and notable, including such figures as Frederick Douglass, Mark Twain, Eugene Debs, President Rutherford B. Hayes, President James Garfield, a lot of the major figures of the age, along with Robert Ingersoll. Okay, so without further ado, I'll read from what I've prepared here, and I'll try and get through it as quick as I can. And then I can't wait to have a more general question and discussion. Okay, so my narrative begins here. On the evening of January 21st, 1892, Walt Whitman was joined for dinner at his home in Camden, Pennsylvania, by a prominent freethinker by the name of Robert Ingersoll. As Whitman's secretary noted in his diary, once some mention was made of Monsieur Daniel Conway between the two men. They fell into discussion of what Conway had unearthed for his then new 1892 biography of Thomas Paine. Ingersoll gave Whitman an account of Paine's funeral cortege. As recorded by Whitman's secretary, Ingersoll remarked that this man, who probably did more than any other man for the liberty of the world, and then that sacred simple cortege, Ingersoll said to Whitman, nothing but an undertaker's wagon, a Quaker on horseback, and three Negroes trudging afoot. What would have been more simple, good, and majestic to make the day holy? To this replied Whitman fervently, saying, noble, noble Paine. Then Ingersoll replied to Whitman, continuing, I was curious to know why the Negroes were there. What Ingersoll found was the fact that these Negroes came and marched and paid this last act of respect to Paine because his first, or one of his first printed pleas had been for the abolition of slavery. Whitman, yes, all of us, were intensely moved, noted the secretary. Ingersoll remarked that it is indeed a lucky find. Here, in brief, we see another instance in miniature of a remarkable phenomenon that took place frequently in America in the late 19th century. The American free thought community brought together and bonding over the life, legend, and mythos, dare I say, of Thomas Paine. And not simply for his opinions on religion, but as much for his thoughts on politics and humanity. My PhD thesis tells the story of how a fascination with Thomas Paine, his life, his works, fostered a community of like-minded freethinkers living in America in the last decades of the 19th century. This movement grew to the point where a minute political party was eventually formed, a party which consciously took its policies and worldview from the works and writings of Paine. This party was known as the National Liberal Party of the United States. My thesis tells the story of the rise and fall of this Paine party in 1870s America and what its significance has in the history and context of US politics. Our story begins in a small town in Illinois called Peoria in 1870. Parker Pillsbury, a then 61-year-old former abolitionist, lecturer, now peripatetic speaker in all sorts of radical causes, has decided to stop off in Peoria because he has heard of a man called Robert Ingersoll, who, not long before, had stood up at a women's rights meeting being held in the city to denounce the opposition of Susan B. Anthony to the recently passed 15th Amendment to the US Constitution, which forbade political discrimination on account of colour, an amendment designed to protect the ability of African American men to vote. Susan Anthony believed that such a step came at the expense of the women's rights movement. As reported in the newspaper, in response to Anthony's charge, Ingersoll had stood up at the meeting and said that voting was not a privilege but a right, and every human being had a right to the ballot. As it happened, this stance perfectly mirrored Pillsbury's own, as he had split from Anthony for the very same reasons only a few months before, and once at Ingersoll's house in this small Midwestern town. It was remarkable to Pillsbury what he found. With Ingersoll away on legal business that day, Pillsbury spent his first full day in Peoria, Illinois, all day in the house or office of Mr. Ingersoll, hunting among Colonel Ingersoll's chaos of books. Here Pillsbury found, as he noted in his diary, many good things, super excellent things, history of all varieties, philosophy, poetry, literature, encyclopedias, and dictionaries innumerable. In particular, a couple of books caught Pillsbury's eye, a volume of Denis Diderot's Encyclopedia, and a copy of Abbe Raynal's History of the Two Indies, and Thomas Paine's letter addressed to Abbe Raynal on the affairs of North America. The history, published in 1780, was a groundbreaking interpretation of European colonization of the Americas. For Diderot, who wrote the section on the Americas, the basic anti-Christian viewpoint carried over to a sympathy for native populations. For as he wrote, the Europeans would force the Indians to adopt another religion. Such missionary endeavour was then only to prepare the way for conquest from the old world, which explores the new world and immediately thinks this land belongs to us. For Diderot, herein lay the hypocrisy. You think like that and you behave like that, and yet you have ideas of religion. Diderot, the materialist follower of Spinoza, who saw all matter as one, instead preached a universal morality, which instead recognized this man, the Native American, as a brother. And Diderot applied this not only to Indians, but slaves and to the Chinese. It was these sections which Paine approved of in his letter to Raynal, as a universal citizen who hopes to see a new system of extending civilization. That these iconoclastic works would be on the shelves in a house in a little town in rural Illinois was simply incredible to the well-travelled Pillsbury. Who is this man, this Colonel Ingersoll? He wrote in his diary that evening. How indeed Ingersoll came to possess such books, or how his interest first developed, remains something of a mystery. Robert Ingersoll had been born in New York State in 1833, son of a Protestant minister who died young. After only a little formal education, Robert and his brother Ebon tramped west as young men in the 1850s searching for opportunity, eventually settling in the middle of Illinois and taking up law. After serving, both of them, in the Union Army in the Mississippi Theater, the Ingersoll brothers entered post-war politics as typical radical Republicans, with Ebon eventually elected a US congressman. At war's end, certainly there was little to distinguish Robert Ingersoll as special, except perhaps when, during a speech commemorating Abraham Lincoln in 1865, he referenced how a man called Thomas Paine had been preeminent during the American Revolution in arguing for black equality, unlike figures like George Washington, who Ingersoll pointed out to the crowd was a slaveholder. To the startled audience in small-town America, Ingersoll pointed out that we have finally achieved in America the same as the men who brought about the French Revolution. Ingersoll, who had already been involved in helping his brother Ebon enter politics, was now encouraged by Pillsbury to go on the stump himself, to join him on the lecture circuit speaking his free thoughts. That meeting between Ingersoll and Pillsbury was the first of 6 annual stayovers by Pillsbury at the Ingersoll home in Peoria over the coming years. That evening, in Peoria, Pillsbury told Ingersoll and the rest assembled his thoughts on Paine while speaking on the topic of the French Revolution. For Pillsbury, the French philosophes provided the foundation for the French Revolution, and Paine's Rights of Man was the way nearly all Americans were introduced to the fundamentals of French revolutionary ideology. From Paine, Pillsbury thought that the implication through the rights of man was to the equality of all people. Paine himself, Pillsbury noted, was a cosmopolitan who said, "The world is my countrymen, all mankind." And he was an example of how to live out this universal credo. Pillsbury's visit certainly seemed to have rubbed off on Ingersoll, who's now soon formed the Peoria Freethought Association and started his first public Freethought lecture career with a speech commemorating the birthday of Thomas Paine. In that speech, Ingersoll's first major Freethought oration, he described Paine as a common labourer in the army of progress. Poverty was his mother, and his greatest political work was the rights of man. In France, he was the lover of democracy, the champion of the rights of man, and he believed in the sacred doctrine of human equality. Calling Paine one of his intellectual heroes, he concluded by asserting that the world is my country and to do good my religion. There is, all the utterances of the world, no grander, no sublimer sentiment. With Pillsbury's encouragement, Ingersoll increasingly brought this ideological viewpoint shaped by Paine into mainstream politics. First by urging his congressman brother to stand by and protect the democratic revolution sweeping the former Confederate states of the South, at that time giving black men the right to enter politics, but also accepting invites to stump for big Republican Party politicians, as he had proven himself, Ingersoll, a powerful orator. A prime example was the Enlightenment Rally, which Ingersoll himself organized in Peoria to host radical Republican Senator Oliver P. Morton during the 1872 presidential election campaign. As noted by a reporter at the scene, this rally seemed to embody Ingersoll's universalist ideals, as he had gotten a crowd of mostly German and Irish democratic working men to listen to 2 politicians who favoured female suffrage talk about black rights. On stage, Ingersoll introduced Morton as having been true to the great principles which are above and beyond party. In Congress, he has favoured the labour movement and voted for the 8-hour system, and he is still true to the old party and to the old doctrines of human rights. Ingersoll then sat on stage as Morton told this polyglot audience that reconciliation with the South cannot come with the abandonment of our principles. By leaving behind the loyal coloured men of the South, who enjoy equal and civil political rights, we cannot abandon them to the Ku Klux Klan. Next step, early the following year, Ingersoll founded the Illinois Thomas Paine Association in Chicago. He uses his inaugural address in Chicago to assert the relevance of Paine's outlook to the real political troubles confronting America at that time. In particular, studying Paine the Radical appears to have given Ingersoll an inside-out view of a culture, a society, dominated by outward displays of Christianity, which only draws Ingersoll to note the hypocrisy. Ingersoll noted, "We have nearly exterminated the Indians, but we have converted none. From the days of John Eliot to the execution of the last Modoc, not one Indian has been the subject of our irresistible grace." Then, looking further afield, Ingersoll asked, "Why should we convert the Chinese heathen overseas and kill our own?" Now, combining the two, Ingersoll noted, "We send soldiers to the west and missionaries to the east to slaughter the Indian while asking the Chinese to embrace a malignant, persecuting creed." At that, the lecturer then read extracts from the Bibles of Oriental creeds. "How much more noble," said he, "were the principles of Confucius than 109th Psalm." Ingersoll had heard of the horrible customs of the Indian, which were no worse than the practices of the church, which warped and mutilated souls. That he was unaware that an Indian had ever scalped another on account of religious belief is the happiest sign that he has not been reached by the average Christian missionary, Ingersoll told the assembled audience in Chicago, probably to gasps. Meanwhile, Parker Pillsbury himself was in Peoria giving a talk on what he called the way of Thomas Paine. For Pillsbury, it was Paine the infidel who had led the way in the devotion to principle when in 1774 he formed the first abolitionist organization with Benjamin Franklin and wrote the first article advocating the immediate abolition in his Serious Thoughts of 1775. Pillsbury continued, after achieving its own liberty and independence, the nation branded Paine an infidel, put the African slave trade into its constitution for 20 years, and continued it until thousands of plantations were stocked with human cattle. Let the priests, deacons, elders, and church members who branded Paine an infidel, who, for 50 years more, continued slavery, let all such scoff as they did at Paine's serious thoughts. His religion was to do good, and the only praise of virtue is to practice it. In a rally to his listeners, Pillsbury asked, can there be no bold devotion, no divine enthusiasm, no self-sacrifice and materialism, liberalism, free religion, not anywhere but the church? To this he urged his audience a religious enthusiasm for Paine, who even without a monument will live in history when such faiths of today have all been forgotten. To follow in Paine's footsteps, according to Pillsbury, was to believe in humanity. Had he lived today, he would be the radical of today. Not just of the anti-slavery conflict, but of all progressive causes. Paine was eminently progressive. In his diary, Pillsbury called his lecture The Religion of Thomas Paine, and it had been clear that for Pillsbury, Paine would be the icon around which his religion of humanity would venerate universal human rights. When Ingersoll returned to Peoria, the next thing the two men did together was to visit the workshops of the local railroad, which Ingersoll represented as a lawyer. He was shocked, Ingersoll, by the poverty and desperation he found there. This is during an economic depression in the 1870s. Rather than just take corporate work, Ingersoll now began to take on maimed railroad workers as clients, arguing in court in favor of greater state regulation, that a corporation holds its rights and franchise subordinate to the general welfare of society. As Ingersoll was making a name for himself, he caught the attention of another prominent American freethinker, Francis Ellingwood Abbott, a former Liberal minister, now the recent founder of the National Liberal League, based in Boston, an organization with branches across the northern states, which argued for a secular state and for the separation of church and state. This largely in response to the role of churches as arms of the federal government, controlling policy on Native American reservations and cultural morality, as evangelical Anthony Comstock monitored the mails for any obscenity as special agent for the federal post office. Now Abbott reached out to Ingersoll and Pillsbury to come join the League. Together the three men would launch a campaign for Paine to get a bust of Thomas Paine inside Independence Hall for the Centennial Founding Fathers exhibit to showcase the 4th of July, 1876. Thomas Paine should have a monument of gold, whose lofty summits should be gilded to ring divine cosmopolitan harmonies, as Abbott put it. The Freethought presses ramped up the religious veneration of Paine. From Paine Hall in Boston, tracts on the Gospel according to St. Thomas were sold. Inside, the reader would repeat phrases like, I believe in the equality of man, or the world is my country, to do good my religion. To the Centennial Paine celebration came figures like Peter Clark, America's first famous black socialist, Wong Chin-fu, America's premier Chinese civil rights advocate, and Clara Neyman, the leading contemporary foreign-born speaker of the women's rights movement. There, this little circle, including Pillsbury and Abbott, gathered around the bust of Thomas Paine to proclaim a national liberal league for the equality of all peoples in their rights. Their little Paine celebration took place in the shadow of Independence Hall. The bust of Paine wasn't allowed in the end. Ingersoll himself couldn't make it. After making a name as the great orator of the Midwest, he'd been invited to nominate America's most popular Republican, James Blaine, at the Republican National Convention in Cincinnati that year, 1876. The tension between the little free thought movement and big-time politics would be there for Ingersoll from the start. But Ingersoll did make it back to Peoria in time to give the 4th of July address in town. When published alongside all the other addresses given by elite liberals that day, Ingersoll stood out as an inversion of the norm. Well, where all other addresses celebrated Washington, Hamilton, and Adams, Ingersoll pointed out that Thomas Paine and the rights of man were the true foundation of the Republic. Where all other addresses celebrated Christianity, Ingersoll told his audience that it was slavery of all kinds over men and women that is upheld by all the churches. And unlike the rest, Ingersoll reminded his listeners that we have only just carried the Declaration of Independence into effect with the emancipation of the Negro, who must be protected. Where all other addresses held up the American Revolution over the French Revolution, Ingersoll did the opposite. To the murmur of the townspeople of Peoria, this is according to the newspaper article, Ingersoll, on the American Centennial, turned to the French Convention as for the best definition of liberty I have ever heard, he told his audience. Liberty, equality, fraternity, the three grandest words in all the languages of men. And it was through the French revolutionary motto that Ingersoll now summed the universalistic political philosophy they had worked out with Parker Pillsbury. To Ingersoll, it was, as he told his audience that day, liberty, give to every man the fruit of his labour. Fraternity, every man is my brother. Equality, the rights of all are equal. No race, no colour can change the rights of men. And I want you to go away with an eternal hatred of aristocracy, of caste, at the idea that one man has more rights than another because he has more money or because he owns a railroad. Ingersoll then concluded his address to the townspeople of Peoria by giving the sentences that would summarise his human rights agenda in the years ahead. To give all others the rights you claim for yourself, I am willing to swear to this. The rich white man can take care of himself. Now we must work for the rest of humanity. Ingersoll's ideological journey over the course of Reconstruction was complete. Now he would bring it to the rest of America. So that really is a kind of a brief synopsis, overview of just some of the content in the first chapter of my thesis, which I hope to turn into a book on the rise and fall of the National Liberal Party. I would go on, but I'm conscious that time is very limited, so I had to be extremely selective in what I picked to speak about, and I thought it would be most apt that I would at least give what were some of the ideological foundations of this party. The subsequent chapters go on to then describe many other figures and how eventually in the late 1870s how these figures networked and came together to, by 1879 in Cincinnati, form the National Liberal Party with the works and writings and philosophy of Thomas Paine really quite close to the center of that party and the platform that it puts forward, which was in its own way uniquely radical for America's Gilded Age. So yeah, forgive me. I'm conscious that I'm famously long-winded, so conscious that I tend to talk over long anyway. I think I'll stop there and open it up to all questions and discussions. Happy, by the way, to talk about other parts of my thesis and about Frederick Douglass or where Mark Twain fits in, etc., etc. But yeah, I'll stop there for now. Thanks, Daniel.
Well, thanks for that. Before everyone else jumps in, I wondered if I could ask you to speak maybe a little bit more about Frederick Douglass and his connection with Paine and with everything else you've spoken about.
Yeah, so long story short, after Ingersoll becomes nationally famous, of course, the following year in 1877, he moves from Peoria, Illinois to Washington, D.C., where he literally moves to a house just around the corner from Frederick Douglass. And of course, two of them are heavily involved in the Republican Party. Ingersoll is a radical Republican. Ingersoll and Douglass first met when Frederick Douglass, was touring the Midwest in 1870. And he actually, Douglass, if you read his memoirs, he describes this episode. I include it in my thesis, where Douglass, as was typical at the time, couldn't find anywhere to stay for the night because he was a black man, even a famous one. And that is in his memoir, Douglass relates to how Ingersoll was the man in Peoria who let him in and gave him a place to stay, and then introduced him the following day to the townspeople of Peoria. So the relationship with Douglass goes back to 1870, and when Ingersoll moves to Washington, D.C., this relationship only grows. Even if Douglass himself had a tortured, very complicated relationship to religiosity and to Christianity, Douglass, I suppose you might describe as a Unitarian or a deist, perhaps even ultimately. I don't know. It's controversial how to sum up Douglass's approach to to Christianity and to religion. But Douglas is certainly more of a religious skeptic than many evangelicals, in no small part because Douglas was raised in Baltimore, Maryland, having to listen to Protestant preachers talk about pro-slavery religion in the 1840s and 1850s. So Douglas and Ingersoll have a correspondence when they live together in Washington, D.C. The two men get to know each other well. They become friends. And in fact, if you're looking for a striking moment where this is revealed, there's a major rally in Washington, D.C. in 1883, which is organized by Frederick Douglass and Robert Ingersoll. Just those two men are the primary organizers. This rally that the two men organized just around the corner from Capitol Hill is given in protest to the Supreme Court overturning of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And the two men give speeches alongside each other. And what's really striking is that in the course of these speeches, uh, Ingersoll, of course, mentions Paine and his history of advocacy on behalf of African Americans, which Douglas recognizes. And Douglas also then speaks about the French Paine, the French Revolution, and the impact that had on the birth of Haiti, the first independent Black Republic, with the Haitian Revolution in the late 18th century. So these two men, Ingersoll and Douglas, were well versed in this late 18th century history, this world, and that was one of the many connective tissues between the two. But as ever, I've been too long-winded.
No, not at all. Yeah, I think, I mean, Douglas famously said, I think, with reference to his own experience, that slave owners didn't become better when they found religion. They became much more brutal towards their slaves. But that aside, I'll ask you one more question and monopolize this just for a little while longer before I invite others to contribute. We were talking earlier before the meeting started. You said that you're in Kansas and it's very hard to get news of the UK in Kansas, which isn't the same anywhere else because it's much harder not to hear about the US wherever you happen to be with everything that's going on there.
Yeah.
So I can't help but ask what uh, Paine or Douglas or Ingersoll might make of the US today as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about Douglas, Ingersoll, Twain, Debs. I mean, what is most striking to me when I research all of these men is in the context of their time, their remarkable moral and political courage and bravery um, against very hostile, antagonistic forces. These men stood up in very public spaces and told everyone honestly exactly what they thought in bold and direct terms. So I think, above all, perhaps, I think Ingersoll and Douglas, and Paine for that matter, I think they would be most, I don't know, shocked, disappointed, outraged that at the lack of brave, bold political speech, thought, and action, you know, where, because ultimately, you think about someone like Ingersoll, when you read his tours around America, he often confronted very direct, physically hostile audiences. They would throw things at him, people would try to assault him, he would be brutally heckled as he tried to give his speeches, and yet on he went. Irrespective of it all, and even for Douglas, of course, even worse. For Douglas, if anything, his tours were much more dangerous. And so I think the two men, they would look at America today, or maybe, I don't know, politics and modern democracies even more generally, and I think they would be disappointed that everyone is online, everything is anonymous, that there's a cynicism, everyone is playing the game, Because there's definitely an innocence to Robert Ingersoll. For better or for worse, he spoke what he honestly believed. I think it's fair to say his credo. And so I think they'd be disappointed that more people aren't doing that.
Well, I'll bring other people in. I can see there's hands raised and questions in the chat. So I'll try and get through them. And if you want to ask a question or make a comment, then just raise your hand or put it into the chat box. So we'll start with Mira Peck, who put into the chat or asked, where does Mark Twain fit into all this?
Yeah. And to be honest, actually, in my thesis, to be frank, Douglas and Mark Twain play in this cast of characters in this play. I suppose they play the role of twin seducer ultimately. Of they're really the two men who managed to convince Ingersoll to rejoin the Republican Party as the smarter political move. So Mark Twain, it's actually quite remarkable. Obviously, the two men knew of each other, but and Ingersoll recounts this in one of his diaries. Mark Twain also mentions it, I think, in his autobiography, or in passing at least. The two men, Mark Twain and Robert Ingersoll, met each other on a train carriage going to Chicago in 1879. And it's all off the basis of that conversation that they struck up a friendship. Both of them were on their way to speak at a rally honoring Ulysses S. Grant in Chicago. Grant had just returned from this world tour. You should read Twain's account of Ingersoll's speech at this rally, where Twain is just mesmerized. And so it's in 1879 that the two men meet, and it's actually Mark Twain when the two men are traveling in Illinois on this train carriage. With everything, of course, Twain is like it's like the journey of Huckleberry Finn or something. The way he meets people, it's Twain that actually convinces Ingersoll to go to the rally, speak on behalf of Ulysses S. Grant and on behalf of radical Republicans and the defense of African Americans in the South. And then it's Twain and Douglas that convince Ingersoll for a period in the late 1870s. Ingersoll formally leaves the Republican Party and helps set up this Freethought Paine Party. And really, actually, it's Twain and Douglas that managed to convince Ingersoll that he'll have more influence over the zeitgeist, over American popular opinion, for all the things that he cares about: women's rights, African American rights, the rights of those who believe in secular government, etc., etc. That he'll have more influence in the Republican Party, which can be debated. But really, actually, Twain kind of briefly pops up in my thesis as a remarkable happenstance, a coincidence. And then the two men, Ingersoll and Twain, remain in correspondence until Ingersoll's death in 1899. And some of their correspondence is very much worth reading. I think there's definitely a case to be made that it's possible that Ingersoll and his worldview, because we know that Mark Twain bought the entire set of Ingersoll's complete works and read them throughout the 1890s, that Ingersoll's kind of inside-out view of American culture definitely shaped Twain's likewise. And in particular, when it came to thinking about minorities in America and American actions abroad. Twain, the last one of the last letters that Ingersoll wrote before he died in 1899 was to Mark Twain, and it was stating his opposition to the US invasion of the Philippines, and of course, Twain at the time was famous for his opposition to American imperialism. So there's definitely, I think, more work to be done there on how the two men, after meeting in 1879, in the subsequent 20 years, how they corresponded and shaped each other's philosophies.
Ian Ruskin asks, in the Reconstruction period and in organizations like the National Liberal Party, what was the influence of deism as a basis of morality, given that Paine and many of the American founders were deists?
Yeah, I mean, what's actually quite striking about the National Liberal Party is that there was a kind of a national community of free thinkers that were first organized by the National Liberal League, which was advocating for a secular state and for the separation of church and state and for the protection of the rights of the agnostic and the atheist. Um, but the free thought community as a whole had a kaleidoscopic range of opinion on religion, as you would imagine. So, I mean, at this convention, which formed the National Liberal Party in Cincinnati in 1879, you had Universalists, you had Unitarians, you had atheists, you had agnostics, you had deists. And so, and this was a party that, a party of secularists, of free thinkers who wanted to come up with proposals for practical proposals for the major political problems of the day. And so, what's actually quite striking about this convention is how much they skirted um, the religious differences within the free thought movement. What's actually really striking about this movement in the late 1870s is just how much it didn't speak for once to the American religious landscape, but instead about America's other political problems of the day. In many ways, actually, what the significance of Thomas Paine is that for all these free thinkers of all different shades of religious opinion, Thomas Paine was really the one icon that they could all unite around and agree upon. And so, really, it's a celebration and a veneration of Paine and a national network of free thinkers who did that brought them all together. But then when they came together, what's striking actually is that in the convention itself, there's very little talk, if any, of Paine's Age of Reason or his deism. It's mostly looking at what were Paine's prescriptions for a good society in the late 18th century. So it's all based on agrarian justice and the general welfare and the rights of man. For example, one of the policies that this convention came up with, forgive me a moment, is what's striking about the National Liberal Party in the late 1870s. It's one of the first parties to actually gently encourage the idea of a welfare state based on some ideas put forward by Paine and agrarian justice for taxation and land and redistribution. And so it's incredible, really, that Thomas Paine is used as this figure, but I think that actually the people who organized this convention were very aware that the free thought community, the one thing they could unite around was the figure of Thomas Paine. And even when it came to the critique of religion, they were all different. So they tended to avoid that topic.
All right, Dr. Marty Schumacher, who has his hand raised, I'll ask you to unmute and you should be able to speak.
Thank you. I'm in Oops, just a sec. I'm in Canada, Dermot, and I've studied a lot of freethinker movements up here in Canada as a humanist chaplain and retired researcher. So I'm wondering whether you are aware of the influence that Ingersoll had, particularly in Victoria and on the political process in our capital city here in BC. He came here in 1884 and he spoke at a huge barn that had so many people coming to it that they had a riot and they had to call the police in because Victoria at the time was a very pluralistic city. Many escaped black slaves, and we had freed, Chinese that had worked in the mines, and so they had settled in a huge Chinatown. There were thousands that tried to get in to hear him speak, and they actually had to call the police in, and they set afire the people who didn't want him to come. So Victoria, this wonderful secular city in BC, had a big thing on its hand when Ingersoll came here. But I was curious as to whether you have any in your research found any effect that Ingersoll and the National Liberation Party had on Canadian politics and our liberal progressive movement. Was there any correlation or collaboration? Because we had a similar movement happening in Canada.
Marty, I'm all too limited. I'm blinkered. I have to protest ignorance when it comes to so much of Canadian history. I had been aware that Ingersoll did go to Canada and that he had a tour there in 1884, that he kind of briefly went across the border and spoke. I didn't know about the specifics of his rally in Victoria and how all that went down. So thank you for telling me, because this is all new to me, that particular thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so hard to get across, Marty, the political and cultural celebrity and phenomenon of Ingersoll in his day and age. He was one of the most famous people in America, and it's hard to reckon with that now, seeing as he's almost entirely forgotten in the popular imagination
Yeah.
completely. Um, so you know what, Marty? To answer you briefly, it is up to me. I am going to have to educate myself on this part of Canadian history and indeed on the liberal progressive movement in Canada because that is fascinating. Because um, I was aware that like the works of Ingersoll began to turn up in all parts of the world in the late 19th century. Famously, Wang Qinfu, this Chinese activist that I mentioned, brought the works of Ingersoll to China and then had them translated. So I was aware that Ingersoll's reach was kind of far broader than I had realized, even outside the United States. But that he had this quite direct influence in Canada, I wasn't aware. So thank you for letting me know about that because this will give me another avenue to go take a research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to Paul, aka Polyp, whose cartoons you might be interested to know frequently appear in the Freethinker. So do check those out. Oh, oh, sorry, Paul, I messed that up.
Am I live?
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. No, really interesting talk. Thanks. It's really interesting to hear that there was a small political party, wasn't it? It didn't have a lot of impact, but that's really interesting. I was just going to raise a point about modern reactions to pain. I'd noticed in my research, I did a biography of him, a graphic novel biography of Paine. And at the end, I try and sort of put a load of quotes about like modern contemporary reactions to him to show his influence. And I've got Carl Sagan, I've got Christopher Hitchens, Kennedy, really interesting one of the few people I could find in American politics talking about Paine. But what I'd noticed is that like one of the few American presidents who's kind of cited Paine was Ronald Reagan, which is the last thing you'd expect, isn't it? I mean, he only tried to. Sorry, somebody's just asked. I'll put the details of the book in the talk in a second. Um, like he only kind of quoted him about begin the world over again, and he was trying to twist that into a reference to like bringing down the evil empire in the Soviet Union. Obama did quote him, didn't he, in his first inauguration, but didn't credit him. The very first inauguration speech, yeah, about Paine's quote about coming out to meet the opposition in winter.
The
I
Summer
should know
Soldier.
Paine's quotes off by heart, but I don't.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, he mentioned him there, but didn't mention that it was Paine.
Huh.
But the most shocking example was one of the few people who really focused on Paine and I think illegitimately tried to co-opt him was the Tea Party. Ian Ruskin will know all about this. Ian Ruskin, who does the one-man show about Paine, feels that he's attempting to be the antidote to this thing. So they get this actor, right, on YouTube. This is maybe 15 years ago to play Thomas Paine. And the guy does know some Thomas Paine. Yeah. He knows two words of Thomas Paine, sense and common. Yeah. And the rest of the videos are these deranged rants about Obama, like just complete crazy pre-MAGA Tea Party nonsense. So it's really interesting that one of the few groups who wanted to try and co-opt, as I say, I think illegitimately, Paine was the Tea Party, the nascent MAGA party, and it's interesting because Paine does kind of appeal to some extent across the political spectrum. So it's really interesting that he's not quoted more. So I was just looking for your reaction and anybody else's reaction to that he's not kind of embedded more in modern political culture, and whether that's just still a reaction to his statements about religion. Nobody wants to touch him like during the end of his life.
Yeah, Paul. I mean, all of that is thank you. That's amazing detail. I mean, I guess it is a tribute of sorts, albeit perhaps a backhanded one, that he gets this mention by top American politicians. And I think the entire American relationship and view of Paine is on two faces. Because there is the pain that Americans celebrate, which is like the first half, the pain of common sense, the pain of the American Revolution. It's all very uncontroversial, and then quite like
Unless you're George III.
well, indeed, yeah, quite. Uh, but then quite like kind of America at the time. I'm referring now to the late 18th century. When Paine goes back to Europe and Rights of Man, Age of Reason, maybe even Agrarian Justice, these works, and then the Paine's image gets caught up in the course of the French Revolution in the American mind, and then there's never been a more dramatic example of from hero to zero when at least amongst the American people as Paine when he goes to Europe and then when he returns from Europe in 1802. At the very start there, Ingersoll and Whitman talk about Paine's funeral in La Rochelle in 1809, which is barely attended, and Paine kind of gets pushed to the side. To your other point, Paul, what I'd say is, I mean, this tension over like how to view Paine, I think it's no fault of Paine's. He was just writing of his time. It's the fact that and freethinkers in the 1870s struggled with this as well. They were inspired by Paine and they wanted to take and lift from Paine. But Paine, of course, was writing in the late 18th century. 1870s America was a much more industrialized society. So the National Liberal Convention in 1879, one of the groups that come to this because they're curious are the Social Democrats of the United States and the Socialist Party. I guess it's called the Labor Workers Party at the time. This is in 1879. They also go to Cincinnati. And one of the reasons why the party struggles is because the left in 1879, at least the socialist left, critiques the rest of the free thinkers at this convention because in their mind, their critique is that Paine, to them, could too easily be interpreted as libertarian. And I guess really it's Paine writes at a much earlier phase of the Industrial Revolution, and so at the convention, the socialists who appear put away Rights of Man and hold up a copy of Marx's Communist Manifesto. And so there's like tension in the American left in the late 1870s. Sorry, your point about Paine then later being quoted by Ronald Reagan and by the Paine the libertarian, or I guess he's been taken as that by some. That's what came to mind. But yeah, it's I hadn't realized that Paine had been quoted by Kennedy. I knew he'd been quoted by Reagan, but I hadn't been aware of the Kennedy and Obama quotes. Perhaps it says something about American politics today that Paine can be openly cited by Reagan, a Republican, and not by Obama. Whatever one wants to make of that. But yeah, sorry, Paul. But by the way, I've made a note of your book, so
I'll pop a link to it on the chat now.
please.
I mean, at the risk of dominating too much, I think it's just really interesting that that Reagan was one of the first politicians to appeal to that kind of the evangelical Christians as a political base, wasn't he? He's one of the first ones I've heard saying, "Come on, I'm Christian like you." So it's all the more surprising that he was willing to quote Paine. He must have known what Paine was like. And this Tea Party guy was ranting about social services as well, whatever it's called, welfare, and has clearly never read Agrarian Justice.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, I guess perhaps, I mean, I've heard Americans say that, Paine, when he first came to America, was sane, and then, went back to Europe and lost his mind. So there is this like, in the, from one perspective, shall we say. So I guess there's a sense of having one's cake and eating it. So, yeah, but clearly, I think it does say something to Paine's continuing influence that there is no, there is by top American politicians, there is still an effort and a desire to quote him and his words, thinking perhaps that they can get away with any of the nuances that might come up afterwards.
Cheers.
Oh, thanks, Paul.
Yeah. I think part of it might also be to do with just the brilliant turns of phrase that Paine could turn, as it were, and very difficult not to quote. them sometimes. But anyway, we'll move on to Elliot.
Thank you. Yeah, I just had a question I wanted to ask about. You had a quote there where I think it was Ingersoll says, that the everybody, just because somebody owns a private or owns a railway company doesn't mean they have more rights than anybody else. And I was just curious about what the National Liberal Party and or Ingersoll had to say about like the robber barons and these massive wealth inequalities that happen, the Gilded Age is famous for. Although we may be on our way to eclipse that, but there was obviously this concern around monopolies and around oligarchs, right? And I was just curious what their stance was on those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, at the convention in Cincinnati in 1879, the elephant in the room was that the conspicuous leader of this party was the massive national celebrity, Robert Ingersoll. And he promoted a lot of Paine's philosophy. He gave a tour about Paine's agrarian justice in 1878, the year before. At the same time, Ingersoll made his fortune as a railroad lawyer. He might have termed himself a progressive railroad lawyer, but a corporate railroad lawyer nonetheless. And he remained so right up until the end of his life in the 1890s. I mean, it's how he made most of his money, actually, not his lectures, from railroad corporations representing them in court. Often making laissez-faire arguments. And so actually this is the core tension, which really kind of splinters the party shortly after its formation between the social democrats who admire Paine but want ownership of the railroads or direct state or federal regulation, and Ingersoll and his acolytes or followers who, perhaps because they are financially compromised themselves, don't argue for such federal ownership or regulation, but instead simply argue for more general redistribution from the rich to the poor through federal taxation. So it is, in terms of how they deal with the robber barons, even the Ingersoll wing of the National Liberal Party when it comes to economics are remarkably progressive for the time. In fact, so far as I'm aware, Elliot, this little party, which is very small and doesn't have a big impact on the American political landscape, but what's significant about it perhaps is its uniquely radical policy platform for the time. And it's the first party in the American context that I'm aware of, which, along with the socialists, argue that essentially the way to fix the problem of the robber barons and massive inequalities of wealth then emerging in American society was to inaugurate a federal income tax. So a graduated progressive federal income tax. That was the same one that was eventually put into the US Constitution in the Progressive era in 1913. So, I mean, they were, even if Ingersoll himself was compromised, they did still use Paine and his general view of society and how to manage wealth inequality as Paine grappled with those issues during the French Revolution. They did still use those to argue for measures that were decades ahead of the political mainstream in America at the time. So, I mean, in that sense, I mean, they were decades ahead of what became known as the progressive movement. Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson in the early 20th century. They were forerunners of that in that regard. A progressive mainstream attempt to solve the issue of massive wealth inequality. But of course, this is where the rubber hit the road between them and the other major faction of the American left at the time, which is the Social Democrats and the Socialist Party, the pure, who simply wanted nationalization of the railroads. And that's where the Ingersoll refused to go along. And so that book does become a major split. But nevertheless, what I would say is, in their own way, their advocacy and love of Paine brought them to a more progressive solution to America's Gilded Age problems than the rest of America arrived at for a couple of decades.
All right, thanks. Very interesting. Thank you.
I know we're past the hour now, but I think maybe we can go for another 5 10 minutes maybe, get a few more questions. Mark in the chat asks about Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce. I think it's pronounced Peirce. Any role, please talk about Charles Sanders Peirce and any role he played.
I'm aware of a journalist who I think is called Bierce, Bierce, who was a freethinker and a fan of Ingersoll. But I'm actually, you'll forgive me, this is my ignorance. I'm not actually familiar, as I probably should be, with Charles Sanders Peirce, but I will look him up online.
Well, we'll go over to Edward then. If you could just
yes, Ambrose. Yes, sorry. Yeah, Ambrose Bierce. That's who that name reminded me of, but I'm aware he's a different individual.
Okay, so I have a little bit of a different tack to run with you. 1879 is the appearance of Henry George's book Progress in Poverty.
Yeah.
And George comes east to New York and creates a international stir with his writings, his visits to the UK and to Ireland and other countries. And Ingersoll eventually somehow finds Henry George. And when George runs in 1886 for mayor of New York, Ingersoll is interviewed and says, "I'm for Henry George." So I wonder to what extent Ingersoll's influence within the free-thinking community translated into any support for George during this period. Although, George's supporters were a real complex group. You had labor and you had individualists. Their view of laissez-faire was very different from the standard view of laissez-faire. They really took after the physiocrats and said, and what Adam Smith said too, and that is, first we have to have just law, and then we can get out of the way. So I'm curious about if your research showed any transition of free thinking support to Henry George and the later single tax movement.
Yeah, in short, Edward, yes. In fact, I know that in that New York mayoral campaign of 1886, Ingersoll didn't just write that letter in support. He did eventually campaign. He gave one speech for George, along with a man called Thaddeus Wakeman, who was the leader of what was called the New York Radical Club. Or it had been known as the New York Liberal Club. Thaddeus Wakeman was also the head of the New York Thomas Paine Society. And so kind of after the breakup of the National Liberal League, of course, all these progressives that had, the National Liberal Party, all these progressives that had come together to try and form this thing in 1879, they do scatter. And they go and you'll see, however, that they, at different times, different members of them re-enter progressive politics and political movements. Ingersoll moved from Washington, D.C. to New York City in 1885. And his main connection to the labor movement in New York City is a guy called John Swinton, major labor advocate, had a big labor newspaper in New York City, and it's through John Swinton that he then becomes familiar with Henry George. So yeah, and I what exactly Ingersoll thought of the land tax. I'm sure he had his critique of the George program, but I think after the collapse of the National Liberal Party, and then the various disappointments Ingersoll has with the Republican Party as it gets further into the 1880s, especially on economics, Ingersoll just becomes broadly supportive of whatever progressive is like. What
I thought it was interesting that he urged all Republicans not to vote for Teddy Roosevelt, but to vote for Henry George.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's because, this is, the Theodore Roosevelt of 1886 is a different beast from as you know, probably much better than me, than the Theodore Roosevelt of the early 20th century. This is when Roosevelt's still a more conservative, less progressive Republican. And in fact, it was in that 1886 campaign, or shortly thereafter, actually, it was in a book that Theodore Roosevelt wrote the following year in 1887, looking at Gouverneur Morris of the Revolutionary era, that in that book, Theodore Roosevelt called Paine famously a filthy little atheist.
Yes.
And if you actually read the passage of that book, Theodore Roosevelt says, we have a few of those in the Republican Party at the moment that I think we should get rid of, which is very obviously a reference to Robert Ingersoll. So, yes, I mean, Ingersoll was eventually, ultimately, in terms of his politics, he just came out for whoever was progressive and whoever he could help on all sorts of issues. Actually, the one issue that Ingersoll had with Henry George is that Henry George supported the Chinese exclusion movement,
Yeah.
the labor issue there. And obviously,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
George, his argument was not against Chinese immigration per se,
yeah.
but Chinese immigrants, Chinese workers without families. He believed that immigration should be directed to bringing families over to establish communities, and that these workers were being taken great advantage of by the railroads and everyone else.
Yeah, but I'm afraid even for Ingersoll, that was too far. So he was just an advocate of Ingersoll wouldn't brook any discrimination when it came to immigration whatsoever. Yeah. Sorry, but thanks, Edward. Sorry, I'm aware that I'm sorry I talk too much.
It's complex, isn't it?
Yeah.
History's messy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Edward. We'll just have time, I think, for one more quick one from Monty.
Yeah, just a quick question. I've been doing the Google search on the National Liberal Party.
Yep.
And even AI can't come up with anything for me. And if there's no links, is there a way you could send links to material for us to read about the National Liberal Party?
Yes. I mean, it's
can't-
yeah, it is. I mean, I discovered it. Really, actually, it was in the this convention. Um, it's in the basically really I first uncovered this convention in Cincinnati in September 1879 in the correspondences and papers of all these various figures. So the Robert Ingersoll papers, which are scattered about in a few different archives, Francis Ellingwood Abbott, Theodore Wakeman, Carl Heinzen. I can certainly I can give the list of kind of like papers and correspondence. Peter Clark. Is it referenced in Frederick Douglass's papers? But mostly, actually, it's but basically my thesis came together mostly by me visiting quite a few archives. Where I don't know, and maybe a lot of that has been digitized now. It wasn't a few years ago. I mean, it must be stressed that this party was minute, just a few hundred people involved, and it was short-lived. And it didn't, I can't say it had a major impact on American politics. I can't make that claim. I can make a claim, I suppose, that it brought together this unique collection of ideological figures who came up with this very original policy platform before the party itself, its internal divisions, split it apart. But yeah, I guess maybe someone better make a Wikipedia page, I guess. um, yeah. So, I mean, I would imagine there's definitely reference to the party in the pages of the Truth Seeker, which you can find online. Because D.M. Bennett, his arrest by Anthony Comstock and his, the trial and the charges, that becomes the immediate trigger to try and form this party. So yeah, you'll find pages of the Truth Seeker, the Boston Investigator, also a kind of a Gilded Age newspaper. And perhaps it's even, dare I say, it might even be mentioned in the Freethinker, which I know was only established a couple of years later.
Oh, the Truth Seeker, the Boston what?
The Boston Investigator. That was another major free thought newspaper at the time.
And what was the third?
Well, I was just pointing out that perhaps it gets referenced in the Freethinker as well, which is I know
Okay,
was a
and what-
UK free thought periodical.
If I go to the Truth Seeker, what year or time period should I also include in the search?
Well, 1879 primarily, and 1880.
1879. Okay, I'm going to go with that. 1879, 1880, the Truth Seeker. I'll start there. Thank you.
Yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch to ask any more questions, you can just do so through the Freethinker website, freethinker.co.uk, and I can put you in touch with Dermot, and you can continue the discussion. But I think for tonight, that's about all we have time for. I'm just going to try and be technological again, and put up our links again. And just politely encourage people to visit the Freethinker, our website, our articles, our historical archive of issues going back to 1881. So maybe there's, as Dermot said, maybe there's mention of the National Liberal Party in there. And also, as a small independent magazine, we do rely on donations and historic funds and the generosity of readers. So if you are willing and able to donate, it would be mightily appreciated. But for now, thank you very much. And thank you especially to Dermot for taking the time. I'm sure we could go on for much longer.
Yeah, thank you, James. Thank you so much for the invite. It's been a privilege and a pleasure and an honor to join the Thomas Paine Memorial Association today and to get a chance to speak on my work and chat with you all. I mean, I've actually learned quite a bit myself, even in just the brief time we've been talking. Forgive me that I can't stay longer. I have a meeting at 2:30 p.m. to get to. This is obviously Kansas time. But probably no bad thing, because I'm aware that with the time difference, I don't want to keep you all too late over there in the UK. But thank you for having me. Yes, and also one final point. Yes, newspapers.com is if you're interested in the National Liberal Party is good, because the party convention itself was covered a bit by papers like the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, also Cincinnati Commercial, those sorts of papers as well. But that's enough from me. And Daniel, thank you so much for having me, and everyone.
All right. Have a lovely evening or afternoon or whatever it is where you are, everyone. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you all.